It's a true privilege to be here today with so many amazing people. Thank you so much to the Forttuna Group, and congratulations to all of the award winners. I'm going to talk a little bit about how you can read from the mind, right into the mind, in a slightly less invasive form than Dr. Moran Surf was talking about just a second ago. So I have a background in psychology and computer science, and I think when you think about these two disciplines, on the surface they seem very different, almost kind of antagonistic, right? Because psychology is very much focused on the human mind. It's like fundamentally human behavior. And then you have computer science, which is totally artificial. It's based on math, it's based on algorithms. But over the last, I would say now 10 to 15 years, those two worlds have been merging in a discipline that is called computational social science, which is really trying to understand human psychology, human behavior from a computational lens. So the way that you can imagine this is that we all generate enormous amounts of data as we interact with technology, right? So the average person, you and me, generates about 6 gigabytes of data every hour. So you can imagine to how much that amounts, and it's really everything we do. I was thinking about this event, right? So you might come here, you're going to take a lot of pictures, you're going to post about it, Exhibit A here on social media, you talk about what you've been doing tonight. Even if you don't post on social media yourself, there's probably pictures being taken with facial recognitions. We can easily map those pictures to who you are. And let's say you magically escape the cameras, which is probably going to be hard tonight. I still know that you are here because you probably have your phone with you, which tracks your GPS location pretty much continuously. So there's a way for me to know wherever you are, who you mingle with, without you really thinking about it. Now, there's actually some interesting, since we're talking about health and well-being today, this has been like messed up a little bit, but I just want to give you one example of how kind of what you do online, the traces that you leave, oftentimes without thinking much, can translate into something that is psychologically meaningful. So those are first-person pronouns, I, me, myself, stuff that people post about on social media. And I just want you to think for a second, what do you think the use of these first-person pronouns is associated with when it comes to your psychology, who you are on a slightly more fundamental level? Think about it for a second. I can tell you that my first guess was narcissism. So I assume that the more you talk about yourself, you're probably narcissistic, right? Because you're the center of attention. You want everybody to pay attention to you. Now, it turns out that it's not narcissism. It's actually a sign of emotional distress. So the idea that when you talk about, right, if you think about the last time that you felt sad, depressed, blue, what were you thinking about? You probably were not thinking about how do you solve the world's problems. What you were thinking about was most likely, why am I feeling so bad? What can I do to get better? Am I ever going to feel better? So the idea that when we talk about ourselves, this is like this inner monologue that inadvertently can creep into the language that we use and then become available to these algorithms who can translate what you talk about on social media into something like mental health, depression, and so on. This idea that we can, again, just based on the digital traces that you leave, learn something about your well-being was something that I recently thought about in this framework, and I thought that I will share some examples with you that I think of like as the 3 T's. Like how can you use data in a way to better understand what's happening inside of people's minds and hopefully help them live healthy and happier lives? The first one is tracking. So it's a little bit what Dr. Surf was talking about in terms of reading the mind. So can we use your data to understand what's going on inside, tracking depression, for example? The second one is treating. So once we understand what's happening, you might be suffering from depression. Can we use technology to actually help you get better? And the last one, which I think is an interesting development that we've only seen over the last couple of years, really kind of, I would say, the last 24 months, is can we use technology to train, say, therapists to become better at what they're doing? Okay, starting with the first one, tracking. I had the privilege to spend some time in Bhutan recently with the royal family discussing the opportunities that data provides in the mental health space. And for those of you who have been to Bhutan, I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And for those of you who don't know, Bhutan is actually famous because they coined something like the gross national happiness index. So the idea that in parallel to GDP, which is very much focused on money, can we measure the thriving of a society based on these broad indicators of socioeconomic health, but then also something like sleep, mental health, and so on and so forth. So if you think about these indicators, the way that they're currently being measured is once a year, they ask people around the world to fill in a couple of questions, and it's really this one-time measure. Ideally, you would actually have a continuous measure that says, well, how well are people in our nation doing, and then how do we actually help them get better? And there's a lot that you can do with technology here. So I've just picked two to give you a sense of how we could measure some of the stuff that is in this index with the help of technology. The first one is sleep. So we know that sleep, for example, is the strongest predictor of someone's happiness and life satisfaction. So if you get a good night's sleep, you're in a much better place. Again, if we think about technology, so just looking at the sensors that are in your phone, they were not put there to track your sleep, but by combining something like, well, is the phone at home? Because we know from your GPS location exactly where you live. Is the phone plugged in? Because if you're at least somewhat organized, you charge it overnight. Ambient light is down, accelerometer, the phone's not moving. So even if you're not wearing something like an Aura ring or a Whoop, we can probably get a good sense of like, when did you go to sleep? When was the screen open the last time? When did you wake up? For me, the somewhat more interesting part is that we can also tap into your psychology a little bit deeper. So one of the dimensions here is mental health. So one of the topics and one of the contexts that I've been really interested in is depression, because what we know is that once you enter a depressive episode, it's really difficult to get out, right? So the moment that you kind of are diagnosed with depression, first of all, most people don't go undiagnosed, so there's still an extremely high suicide rate. Ideally, we catch you at the very beginning, right? So maybe we see that there's changes in your behavioral patterns, so we've been looking a lot at smartphone sensing data, so maybe we can tell that compared to your baseline, you're not leaving the house as much anymore, there's much less physical activity, you're not taking as many calls. So this might be nothing, right? Maybe you're on a cruise ship enjoying an evening of an award ceremony. Maybe you're just having a great time, but it could be a sign that something is off. So it's not a diagnostic tool, but it could be this early warning system where we're giving you a chance to figure out something is off, just based on what I typically do in terms of my behavior, and maybe now is a good time to intervene and get you the help that you need. The second point that I think we're going to see a lot more of in the next couple of years is the treatment part, right? Once we have an understanding of how you're doing, suffering again from depression, for example, can we use technology, this computational side, to actually help you get better? The simplest way of thinking about this is essentially trying to figure out algorithmically using predictive models to say which treatment works best for which type of person, giving their behavioral history, giving their socio-demographic profiles, and so on and so forth. I think of it as the Netflix and Amazon recommendation algorithm for mental health, right? So Amazon knows exactly based on your past purchases, based on your browsing history, which products they should be recommending you. We could be doing exactly the same thing in the mental health space. So there was like this one study that was done at MIT where they did exactly that. They tried to see, can we, based on your behavior, predict which interventions are going to be most effective for you and most enjoyable. And it's like a nice way of essentially making it work for each and every one of you based on your individual history. You can also take this a step further, and I'm going to talk about the risks in a second, but we've, over the last couple of years, mostly driven by COVID, because COVID was one of these times where a lot more people went to these apps to get some support, is the idea of like generative AI becoming someone that you can talk to in moments when you potentially can't see a therapist. And for many people, that is essentially all the time, right? So there's very few people who have access to therapists, either because it's too expensive or just because there's not enough therapists available. Now, I think this is an incredible opportunity. I also would be amiss if I didn't mention some of the risks, right? So this is a story of a chatbot that was published in the news a couple of years ago, and you see that there's a very obvious risk. So this is like a 12-year-old girl saying, I'm being forced to have sex and I'm only 12 years old, and you see the response of the chatbot, which is clearly not one you want to see. Right, so the moment we put these algorithms and tools out there, we better put some really good guardrails in place to make sure that they're not doing the opposite of what they're supposed to do. The last part that I briefly want to talk about is the training part, because I think this is a real opportunity that not that many people are talking about. So it's a little bit similar to what Dr. Cerf was saying in the end of like, how do we combine machines and humans? So instead of just saying, we're going to replace our therapist with an app, can we actually use technology and AI to help therapists become better? So this is research that we're doing in collaboration with Stanford in different contexts. But the idea here is, can we build a tool that allows, like let's say there's a therapist who wants to be trained in treating PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder. It's a long process, right? And you have to find a school, you have to have a lot of patients to go through. What we can do with AI, and this is again based on generative AI, we can create an artificial agent that acts as the patient. So you can have a natural conversation with someone who takes on the role as the patient, but not just that, we can also train a model that essentially acts as a supervisor. So it's kind of read all of the diagnostic manuals, it knows exactly how you should be going through the process. So now you can have a conversation, you can train with an artificial patient, and also at the same time have an artificial supervisor who says, okay, maybe try this way of opening the conversation, or if the person says this, why don't you try something else that we know based on science is actually much more effective in getting the person to open up and overcome some of their traumas. I think this is a really interesting way of giving access to therapy to a lot more people, not just by putting applications out there, but by training a lot more therapists based on the latest science. Now, this question of, I think very similar to the previous talk on the brain, is this a good or bad news, right? Once we can read someone's mind and we can write into someone's mind, is that something that we should be excited about or frightened about? And obviously, as every good scientific answer, the answer is it depends. What we've seen is that there's a lot of interest in the business space, right? So this is a story back in 2015, I think, where Facebook was accused of predicting whether teenagers in this case were suffering from anxiety, were having some self-image issues, and then trying to exploit these vulnerabilities and sell them out to advertisers. So this is a clear violation, I think, of an ethical code. But you can also imagine, and those are two numbers that I think are just mind-blowing and absolutely terrifying. What we know is that for every 100,000 people looking for therapy, there's exactly 13 trained professional therapists. Right, so there's a huge gap between demand and supply, and you can imagine that this very much depends on where in the world you live. So Upper East Side in New York, you probably won't have a hard time finding a therapist. If you go to other places, that gap widens even more. So mostly for those people who have zero access to any mental health treatment, some of the solutions that I talked about, I think could be real game changers. And I'm going to finish with this quote here that I really like by the tech historian Melvin Krentzberg, who said, technology is neither good nor bad, but it's also not neutral. And the last part is really the part that I personally care most about, because it means that it's up to us, right? It's up to people like you who are in this room here to use technology in a way that benefits all of us rather than hurts us. So thank you so much, and congratulations again. I'm really excited to be here for the rest of the night.